Hi, I'm Bronwyn Gresham, and this is a talk that I gave as part of the 2018 Climate Adaptation Summit, hosted by the Victorian government. I spoke in my role as volunteer with Psychology for a Safe Climate, a small non-for-profit organisation, and I'd like to acknowledge Carol Ryde, our president, for supporting me in developing this talk. Before I begin, I would like to open by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, and that might be many and varied depending on where you are listening. For me here, it's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I would like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. May we learn to synthesise knowledge within our love for land, solutions for beyond zero emissions and living in a new geological epoch, the Anthropocene. For those of you unfamiliar with the work at Psychology for a Safe Climate, our group formed because as psychologists, we understood that engaging with climate change was more than just a rational or intellectual task, it was an emotional one as well. We applied our knowledge of psychological resources and processes like distancing, denial and apathy, and captured this in one of our publications called Let's Talk About Climate Change. But we also knew from our experience just how hard it was to talk about this stuff, even to the people closest to us. Raising climate change in a conversation was met with discomfort, shutting down, and even anger sometimes. So we captured some of our stories in our second booklet called Facing the Heat, with the intention of providing some psychological understanding to what might be going on in those tricky interpersonal moments. It is now with some relief that the taboo about talking and acknowledging climate change is shifting. The latest polls indicating that the majority of the public now accept climate change is human-caused, and they're willing to support changes even at some cost. What we are observing, however, is that there is a new taboo, speaking about how bad it really is. Ian Dunlop, who is a former Shell executive and now leading expert on climate change, said in a talk recently, "The problem is bigger than we have been admitting. We are now in an existential emergency." Even as I say this now, I am wary it might not be what people want to hear. I don't even want to hear this. Naturally, emergencies are distressing and not something we want to be true. In fact, the part of my brain wired to social approval cautions me not to raise this at all for fear of being judged or ostracised as an extremist. Indeed, we are seeing the same defence mechanisms at play around this notion of seriousness and urgency of climate change within ourselves, organisations and politics. So at PSC, our work has shifted to supporting people who are facing the full reality, however much they don't want to believe it. And we achieve this through providing workshops that are based on two fundamental assumptions. Firstly, that climate change does activate strong negative emotions, even existential issues. They raise questions about the survival of humanity, and that is frightening and even unthinkable. This knowing requires us to tolerate so many different tensions and paradoxes and ethical dilemmas, like how we are both part of the problem and solution. And secondly, they are based on the assumption that emotions and these tensions and ethical dilemmas, they require tending to. If we ignore them or push them aside, they tend to build up. There's this saying in psychology, well, it's a principle really, that what you resist will persist. So our workshops function to allow people reflective space to give expression to their emotions, their thoughts and their dilemmas, and then to find ways of constructively responding to their emotions. And participants come from all stages of life, careers and disciplines of work, from community organisers, policymakers, activists, health professionals, engineers and scientists, to name a few. One theme that concerns participants that we hear again and again is that we have missed the possibility of limiting our warming to 1.5 degrees. And connected with this is this frustration and tension between what the world governments are doing and what we should be doing to limit that warming. Participants are feeling angry, despair, hopelessness and helplessness around these issues, and some people even needing stress leave from work. We are also seeing how participants and their feelings related to climate change are related to how they're coping in life in general and connected to their various life stage. We're seeing young adults who are expressing ambivalence about whether they will even have children, and older adults worried about their grandchildren. Yet so far our outcomes have been profound and so moving to witness. Participants change to express the breadth and depth of emotions they experience. This cathartic process sees emotions as understandable and defense mechanisms as part of being human, something we all do, that it's not our fault we feel this way, that we're not bringing it on ourselves. So the whole breadth of emotions becomes normalised. Most notably, the most profound reported outcome is benefiting from a shared experience. They develop what we call a sense of common humanity. And we know from compassion research that this is like a soothing balm to the loneliness we can feel when facing painful emotions. Through our work, we see that health and mental health problems related to climate change are occurring right now in real time. And I emphasise this because it's so easy to think impacts of climate change are in the future. And this psychological distancing is an understandable strategy for self-protection, but one that undermines systemic action now. And what we're observing in our workshops is reflected in the research. The American Psychological Association released their latest findings in a booklet called Mental Health and Our Changing Climate: Impact, Implications and Guidance. While I won't cover the report here, I'd like to comment on a few areas that are paralleled in the work that we do. So the first is called eco-anxiety. And for the most part, it's so easy to understand the grief and loss people experience if they've been a victim to a flood, a drought, a fire. There are tangible losses of home, of possessions, but also psychological losses around sense of identity and place. And people can empathise and make sense of why people would feel traumatised from those experiences. The experience itself is traumatising. What is perhaps less understood, however, is the anxiety, grief and fear felt towards anticipated climate change. But what is perhaps less understood is how people feel around the fear of climate change and their sense of efficacy to make a difference, and that this leads to anxiety, fear, resignation and helplessness. And this phenomena is being coined eco-anxiety. Another phenomena being observed is called solastalgia, which was coined by Albrecht in 2005, but connected with this a concept of ecological grief. And this is when people feel intense loss, sadness and grief in relation to experienced or anticipated environmental change, such as loss of species, the landscape and our ecosystems. People feel like they're losing their sense of place. And research tells us that people who are strongly attached to where they live and to their local communities report greater happiness, life satisfaction and optimism. So this loss of place or anticipated loss is no trivial matter. One of the most interesting links for me as a clinical psychologist working in community mental health is the link between heat and aggression. There are studies now demonstrating that there is this causal link, and it may be around how heat impacts our levels of arousal and cognitive functioning, but there is also demonstrated link between heat and increases in suicide for people who are socially and psychologically more fragile. So imagine with our, if with our suicide prevention strategies and our domestic violence policies, if we were to be holistic around these prevention strategies, we would be having to include climate change on the agenda. So there are compounding stressors that impact on our relationships and problematic coping strategies like gambling, smoking and drinking, which impact on our sleep, digestion, immune systems and mental health. It is absolutely no wonder that The Lancet back in 2012 stated that climate change will be the biggest health threat of the 21st century. So how do we respond and adapt? Well, this is a huge question, and there are a handful of sensible recommendations in the report. But there is one psychological resource that I have a particular interest in, one that has the power to help us both regulate our difficult emotions and inform effective policy change, and it's called compassion. This model by Paul Gilbert and Pema Chodron represents a very simplified version of our three key emotional systems. Each system has appropriate and much needed functions. However, problems arise, generally speaking, when our systems are out of balance. At this point in our culture, we typically overvalue our drive system, which, as they note, it is our excitement and drive system, our competitive psychology, that will gobble up the Earth's resources if allowed to. And we generally underutilise and underappreciate the affiliation and soothing systems. So how is this relevant for effective action on climate change? How can compassion help? I'd invite you to consider the analogy of a doctor and patient here. So the doctor, on seeing the patient, is required to assess the problem, the symptoms, through observing them just as they are, with a presence of openness to what is present, not to be distracted by their own particular background or beliefs or get caught up in blaming the patient or judging the patients, but just to assess the symptoms. No minimising, no over-dramatising. Then they need to deliver the diagnosis, and the delivery style is incredibly important. Imagine you as a patient, how you'd like your doctor to inform you. When you're in that kind of vulnerable or frightened position, your best chance of accurately hearing the message is if the doctor can deliver with calmness and accuracy. There's this saying, our brains are set up to be calmed in the face of kindness, so our tone and word choice is critical. But the doctor can't stay focused on the symptoms. They must turn their attention to solutions and treatment. What will this person need to relieve their suffering? If the person has a heart condition, say high blood pressure, and you say, let's meet in another week's time before we treat this, that is a potentially life-threatening situation. Also, if the doctor prescribes rest and relaxation, that's just not a sufficient response. The response must be prompt and match the diagnosis in order to be effective and for the patient to feel hope. Once implemented, there may be scope to consider the body system as a whole, influencing factors, what might be maintaining the problem, protective factors, and building quality of life. So a compassionate response to climate change involves a delicate synthesis between acknowledging and seeing the problem, but also working on the solutions. If we stay focused too long on the problem, we risk compassion fatigue, burnout, despair, and overwhelm. If we focus too much on the solutions, we risk them not being matching and adequate to the problem. Compassion is a powerful and often underutilised resource. However, as Gilbert and Schoden state, when kindness and compassion influence social and political discourse, the results can be dramatic. Thank you so much for listening today. We really hope that this talk provides food for thought and consideration, and we always welcome feedback and comments. Thank you. See you later.